John, I found it extraordinary, though, this week where Peter Dutton went to Alice Springs. He said he spoke to social workers and said that these stories are horrific and abuse is rampant across in Alice Springs in particular. And there's been a week of quibbling about the language that he used. What do you think of that?
Oh, look. Well, I'm frustrated. When I was Minister, of course, we were also, as government, challenged by these fundamental and substantial issues. We increased spending, but increasing spending in of itself is not an achievement. All that is spending more money. And of course, the more you spend, the more you discover, because you get more boots on the ground and you start to see the depth of the problem. Throwing rocks at Peter Dutton is pointless, because it actually tries to obfuscate the real issue here, which is the vulnerability of these children. Unfortunately, in the Northern Territory and in other places in Australia, but particularly pronounced in the Northern Territory, walls of protection have been built around Aboriginal people, either through systems of land ownership or whatever the case may be. And those walls of protection have the unintended consequence of also becoming walls of a prison. So these Aboriginal people are often caught in these policy structures. So you get things like the Royal Commission into the Stolen Generations, the Bringing Them Home report, saying, look, we have to have kinship care and those sorts of things developed. And so you get this policy shift towards kinship care, which is occasionally at the expense of the child being placed into care. So the cultural rights start to get ascendancy over the human rights, and that should never be allowed to occur. When I was Minister, we had to actually sack a staff member who endorsed the marriage of an adult to a child because they were too blinded by the desire to protect cultural rights without focusing on the rights of the child.
And that seems still to be happening, John. I mean, the central claim here that, you know, politicians have quibbled over for a week, which absolutely does my head in, is that Aboriginal children are being taken from foster parents and returned to dysfunctional homes where they are at risk of abuse. I mean, did you ever see anything like that? Is that still happening?
I was often criticised for my attitude in relation to this, particularly when I gave evidence in front of the Royal Commission, that I was highly critical of this notion that above all else you should place a child amongst their cultural peers. Now, that's a preferred position, and I'm not necessarily against that. But the preferred position shouldn't, or the idea that cultural heritage is the only driver, is what I find objectionable. The child should be safe in the first instance. The child should be provided with security, have a roof over their head, a good meal in their stomach, and then we can start to focus on things like cultural rights. But the human rights of safety and certainty is what a child needs above all else. And unfortunately, that's being lost. And it's become a fashion, certainly in the last 10 years, to elevate cultural rights. If you look at the Northern Territory government's current policy, they have a culturalist security policy attached to child protection, which obviously says that cultural security is more important than necessarily the security of the children themselves.
Yeah, and they've said that, haven't they, John? They said that with the alcohol laws, that they didn't want to make them at all racist or towards one race. But the fact is that this is happening among Indigenous communities at a higher rate. I mean, there's been lots of calls. Royal Commission, Snake want a new Children's Commissioner. If I could briefly ask you what you think needs to happen right now.
Well, what needs to happen is that we focus on the children, that we have an effective approach of collecting those abandoned children and looking after them. Every time that I raise this issue, the first challenge that I'm confronted with is, oh, you're advocating for another stolen generation. We're not dealing with a stolen generation, we're dealing with an abandoned generation. And that's the challenge that faces government. So those kids need to be made secure. Those kids that are walking around Alice Springs 10, 11, 12 years old at 3 o'clock in the morning should be the subject of some sort of care order, and they're not, because we are walking on eggshells around the cultural sensitivities and the political argument that invariably follows. A kid who is hungry, a kid who is tired at 3 o'clock in the morning, or a kid who is petrol sniffing, those challenges are much more important for that child's future than necessarily what language they speak, or alternatively what cultural background they have.
Well said, John. Thanks so much for your time this morning. Appreciate it.
No worries, Lauren.